A true story of an African politicians and what they do. Honorable Dino was a master of appearances. Every time he stepped onto a podium, the crowd erupted. His voice was calm, confident, and perfectly rehearsed. He spoke of hope, youth empowerment, security, and development. Cameras loved him. Children waved flags when his convoy passed. Old women prayed for him, believing he was the answer to their suffering. Silas knew exactly what to say. He wore simple clothes during campaigns to look humble, even though his wristwatch could pay a teacher's salary for 10 years. He visited orphanages with journalists watching, dropped donations with dramatic smiles, and promised roads, hospitals, and jobs. His posters were everywhere. Clean face, gentle eyes, the slogan service above self. But when the microphones went off, the man disappeared. Behind the closed doors of his government office, Silas transformed. The same lips that preached justice now issued threats. The same hands that shook the poor signed illegal contracts and death orders. His office lights often stayed on till midnight, not because he was working for the people, but because deals were being sealed in silence. Drug routes were discussed over expensive wine, land seizures were approved with careless signatures. Opposition names were written on paper and pushed aside with one word: handle it. Silas did not see himself as wicked. He saw himself as smart. To survive politics, he once said, you must be feared. Money flowed endlessly. Bribes arrived in brown envelopes and foreign accounts. Contractors inflated projects that were never completed. Security votes meant to protect citizens vanished into private mansions, luxury cars, and offshore investments. Outside, the city struggled with poverty and hunger. Inside, Silas lived like a king. Yet even in his wealth, something dark followed him, an arrogance that made him careless. He laughed at the law. He mocked morality. He believed the system belonged to him, that he was untouchable, protected by power, money, and silence. That belief was his greatest mistake. Because while Silas was busy perfecting his public image, he failed to notice something dangerous growing quietly in his shadow. A witness. And the beginning of his end. 5. Power to Dino was not something to be debated, it was something to be defended. Behind the bright smiles and public speeches existed another world. Quiet, brutal, and carefully hidden. It was in this world that Silas decided who lived loudly and who disappeared silently. Opposition voices rose from time to time. A youth leader questioned missing funds. A journalist began asking uncomfortable questions about land seizures and drug routes. A rival politician hinted at exposing contracts that never built roads. Silas listened calmly. Then he acted. Meetings were held late at night in rooms with no windows. Phones were switched off. Names were mentioned once and never repeated. Silas never used violent words. He simply leaned back, folded his hands, and said things like, "This noise must stop," or "Handle it before it spreads." Everyone in the room understood. The journalist died on a lonely highway. Official reports called it an accident. The youth leader vanished after a meeting. His family told he had traveled abroad. A rival politician survived an attack but lost his courage forever. Fear did the rest of the work. Silas never pulled a trigger that he never needed to. Money paid for silence. Threats kept families quiet. Police reports were rewritten. Evidence burned in metal drums behind government buildings. By morning, the city moved on unaware or pretending to be. At press conferences, Silas condemned violence with a straight face. He ordered investigations he knew would go nowhere. He promised justice for victims he personally erased. Inside, he felt powerful. "Fear is stronger than loyalty," he once told a close aide. "People obey longer when they are afraid." And they did. Civil servants avoided his name in private conversations. Journalists softened their reports. Activists chose exile over burial. Silas's shadow stretched across the city, long and cold, choking courage wherever it passed. But what Silas never considered was this. Every act of blood leaves a trail. Every silence hides a witness. And every secret, no matter how deep, is heard by someone listening closely. While he was busy eliminating enemies outside, danger was quietly entering his inner circle, watching, remembering, and recording. The curtain was thick with blood. And behind it, justice was learning his name. Land was life. To the people of the villages surrounding the city, land was more than soil. It was memory, inheritance, and survival. Graves of ancestors rested there. Children were born there. Families farmed the same plots for generations, believing that as long as the land remained, hope would remain too. Dino saw something else. He saw money. With one signature, entire communities disappeared. He labeled their homes government acquisition or urban development zones. Papers were forged overnight. Survey maps were redrawn. By morning, land that belonged to poor families for over 100 years now belonged to companies secretly linked to him. The evictions always came at dawn. Black SUVs arrived with armed police. Bulldozers followed behind like metal beasts. Women screamed. Children cried. Old men stood shaking, holding worn land documents that no longer mattered. Widows suffered the most. Their husbands were gone. Their voices were weak. Silas's agents targeted them deliberately, knowing they had no one powerful to defend them. Some knelt in the dirt, begging. Others clutched his convoy, crying his name as if he were a savior. He never stopped. From behind tinted glass, Silas watched without emotion. He never stepped out. He never listened. Orders were orders. Clear the land, he said. Compensation will be discussed later. Later never came. The land was sold to foreign investors and luxury developers. Mansions rose where mud houses once stood. Resorts replaced farmlands. Fences were erected to keep the original owners out. Owners who now slept under bridges and in unfinished buildings. When complaints reached the media, Silas acted innocent. He blamed unknown officials. He promised investigations. He donated bags of rice to displaced families for cameras. Behind the scenes, he laughed. These people don't even know the value of what they sit on, he told his associates. I'm doing them a favor. The tears of widows watered the land. The hunger of children paid for his luxury. But every eviction created bitterness. Every demolished home planted anger. Mothers whispered curses through tears. Fathers swore that truth would one day rise from the soil Silas stole. And unknown to him, every land document, every forged signature, every illegal transfer was being quietly copied, saved, and preserved by someone very close to him. The land remembered. The people remembered. And soon the world would remember too. From the outside, Dino's home looked perfect. Tall gates, polished marble floors, quiet guards, and soft lights glowing through wide windows. People whispered that his wife, Amara, was the luckiest woman alive. Inside, the house was cold. Silas ruled his home the same way he ruled his office, through control and fear. He decided when Amara spoke, where she went, who she met, and how she spent money that legally belonged to both of them. He treated her opinions as noise, cutting her off mid-sentence or silencing her with a sharp look. At dinner, he scrolled through his phone while she waited tonight. He came home late without explanations, and in public, he smiled beside her. In private, he erased her presence. When Amara questioned his constant absences or rumors of other women, Silas responded with cruelty. He mocked her age, her appearance, her patience. "Be grateful you're still here," he once said. "Many women would replace you without asking questions." Those words lived in her chest like stones. He embarrassed her at events, introducing her last, ignoring her hand, walking ahead while cameras rolled. He cut her allowances without warning, forcing her to ask for basic needs while he spent freely on mistresses. When she cried, he called it weakness. When she stayed silent, he called it obedience. The house staff noticed everything. They saw Amara eating alone at a long dining table meant for family. They heard her crying softly behind locked doors. They watched her flinch whenever Silas raised his voice. Silas justified his behavior easily. "A man of my position cannot be questioned," he told himself. "Respect is control." But Amara knew the truth. Love had died long ago. She stayed not because she was weak, but because she feared what Silas could do if she left. She had seen how he treated enemies. She had heard the whispers. Silence became her survival. Sometimes late at night, she stood by the window and watched his convoy disappear into the darkness. In those moments she felt invisible, married to power yet completely alone. What Silas never realized was this. A man who cannot show kindness at home will eventually be exposed outside. A house built on fear cannot hide forever. And while Amara suffered quietly, another woman was moving freely through Silas's life, listening, watching, recording, turning his cruelty into evidence. The peace he destroyed at home would soon destroy him. Dino believed his office was an extension of his will. Once someone stepped into his world, his ministry, his mansion, his campaign offices, they stopped being human in his eyes. They became tools. And tools were meant to be used, controlled, and discarded. In government buildings, fear walked the corridors before Silas arrived. Staff straightened their backs, lowered their voices, and avoided eye contact. Files were approved without questions. Illegal payments were processed as urgent directives. Anyone who hesitated was transferred, demoted, or quietly dismissed. Silas called it discipline. Female staff and domestic workers suffered the most. He used power the way predators use darkness. Compliments became demands. Invitations became threats. Refusal meant losing jobs or worse. Some cried in silence. Some accepted money out of fear. Some were forced to sign agreements they did not understand. When one young domestic worker threatened to report him, Silas laughed. "Who will believe you?" he asked calmly. "You can't even afford a lawyer." The next day, she was escorted out by security, her phone seized, her salary withheld. By evening, an envelope arrived at her doorstep, money wrapped in warning. She never spoke again. Complaints never reached police desks. Files disappeared. Names were erased. Silas's aides knew the routine well. Deny, delay, destroy. To the public, he preached about women's rights and worker protection. The victims, he was the law. He bribed inspectors to overlook violations in companies he secretly owned. He forced approvals for illegal businesses tied to his drug operations. Civil servants who knew too much were rewarded with promotions, or threatened into silence. Power intoxicated him. He bragged openly among close associates. "In this country," he said, "your position decides your innocence." And for a long time he was right. But what Silas did not know was that every abuse created a trail. Every silenced victim left behind messages, dates, witnesses, and scars. And someone very close to him was quietly collecting them all. Recordings, screenshots, testimonies, turning pain into proof. Abuse of office had become his habit. Arrogance had become his weakness. And soon, the very position he used to destroy others would become the rope that pulled him down. Dino did not fear the law. He owned it. Courts, police stations, and investigative panels were only obstacles to be managed. Over time, Silas perfected the system, an invisible pipeline where money flowed upward and protection flowed downward. When petitions arrived, his aides intercepted them. When arrests were suggested, calls were made. When cases were filed, envelopes appeared. Judges received appreciation. Senior police officers were promoted for loyalty, not integrity. Investigators who asked too many questions were transferred to remote posts or buried under endless bureaucracy. Files vanished from shelves. Evidence was misplaced. Witnesses suddenly recanted. Silas called it clean hands, not because he was innocent, but because no dirt ever stuck. In private meetings he joked about it. "The law is like a gate," he said, smiling. "You only need to know the gatekeeper." He funded election campaigns for top officials, paid school fees for their children abroad, and built houses in their names. In return, they returned favors, quietly and efficiently. One drug shipment was intercepted at a port once. For a brief moment, Silas felt irritation. By evening, the officers involved were suspended, the cargo reclassified as clerical error, and the container released. Another time, a special panel was set up to investigate land grabbing. Silas appeared before them, calm and confident. By the end of the week, the panel was dissolved due to lack of funds. At press conferences, Silas condemned corruption passionately. He called for transparency. He demanded accountability. The irony did not bother him. To the public, he looked spotless, always smiling, always cooperative, always innocent. To the system, he was a sponsor. But corruption has a hunger. The more Silas bribed his way out, the bolder he became. He stopped hiding well. He spoke freely. He left digital trails, bank alerts, messages, voice notes. He assumed loyalty was permanent and silence was guaranteed. He was wrong. Because while judges were paid and police were bought, evidence was being copied. Conversations were being recorded. Transactions were being mapped. Someone within his inner circle was watching how the gates opened, and writing down every name of every gatekeeper. The law he bent for years was quietly straightening its back. And when it finally stood upright, it would no longer recognize him. 5. Mira entered Dino's life quietly, without noise, without drama, without the desperation he was used to seeing. They met at an exclusive political fundraiser held in a grand hotel ballroom. The room glittered with chandeliers and false smiles. Politicians laughed too loudly. Businessmen competed for attention. Women hovered close to power, hoping to be noticed. Mira did none of that. She stood at the edge of the room, dressed simply but elegantly, watching everything. She spoke little, listened carefully, and smiled only when necessary. That calm confidence caught Silas's attention immediately. When he approached her, she did not rush him with praise or flattery. She did not mention his achievements or beg for favors. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions and let him talk. Silas loved to talk about himself. He was used to women who wanted money, connections, or protection. Mira wanted conversation. She laughed at the right moments and stayed silent when he expected awe. That silence made him curious. Dangerously curious. Within weeks, Silas arranged private meetings, quiet dinners, late-night drives, discreet hotel rooms. He felt powerful beside her, yet strangely relaxed. Mira made him feel intelligent, important, untouchable. He told her stories he had never told anyone else. He complained about Amara, calling her ungrateful and boring. He bragged about crushing enemies. He laughed about bribing judges and buying police loyalty. Mira never interrupted. She only listened. Silas mistook her silence for admiration. He believed she was impressed by his power, his fearlessness, his control over life and death. He never asked why she remembered details so clearly. He never noticed how she avoided being photographed or how she always positioned her phone face down. To Silas, Mira became a safe place, a secret escape from responsibilities and criticism. He trusted her more than his aides. He spoke freely around her, careless and proud. What he didn't know was this. Mira had come into his life with open eyes and a closed heart. Every meeting was a lesson. Every confession was evidence. Every careless word was recorded in her memory, and sometimes on her devices. Silas believed he had found another woman he could control. In reality, he had invited a witness into the center of his darkness. And from that moment on, his fall was no longer a question of if, only when. Mira's greatest weapon was not anger or revenge. It was attention. While Dino spoke, Mira listened. Deeply, patiently, without judgment. She learned his rhythms. When he boasted, when he relaxed, when he grew careless. She noticed how his voice changed after a drink, how pride loosened his tongue, how arrogance made him forget danger. Silas talked too much. He spoke about meetings that should never exist, late-night gatherings with contractors and traffickers, phone calls that ended lives, routes that moved drugs across borders under the protection of uniforms. He mentioned names casually, laughing as if they were trophies. Mira remembered everything. At first, she relied on memory alone. She replayed conversations in her head, writing notes later. Dates, locations, names, amounts. Soon she began to record. Short voice notes when Silas paced and ranted. Screenshots of messages that arrived at odd hours. Photos of documents left carelessly on tables. She backed everything up. Then again. In apartments Silas paid for, Mira placed small hidden cameras. Not everywhere, just enough. She never rushed. She waited for moments when Silas felt safest. When he bragged about owning the police. When he joked about judges who ate well. When he dismissed victims as noise. Sometimes he spoke cruelly about his wife. "She complains too much," he said once, waving his hand. "She should enjoy the house and keep quiet." Mira said nothing. She watched him sign papers he pretended not to read. She watched aides come and go with envelopes. She watched fear bow to power. And she catalogued it all, calmly, methodically, turning chaos into a timeline. Silas mistook her silence for loyalty. He trusted her with passwords, he left his phone unlocked around her, he took calls in her presence. Each mistake became proof. There were nights Mira went home and shook with the weight of what she carried. The crimes were heavier than she expected. The cruelty was deeper. But she steadied herself with one thought. Truth needs witnesses, not noise. By the time Silas realized he spoke most freely around Mira, it was already too late. She had become the keeper of his secrets, the archivist of his crimes, the quiet judge in the room. And while Silas believed he was untouchable, Mira was building something stronger than power. A record. A record that would soon speak for everyone he had silenced. The cracks in Dino's home did not appear suddenly. They widened slowly, silently, like walls weakening under constant pressure. Amara felt it first. She noticed how Silas no longer pretended. He stopped explaining his absences. He no longer apologized for missed anniversaries or public humiliation. Even basic courtesy disappeared. When she spoke, he answered without looking up. When she cried, he walked away. The house had become a hotel, and she was the unwanted guest. Silas grew harsher with his words. He criticized how she dressed, how she spoke, how she carried herself. Sometimes he compared her openly to other women. "Look at you," he once said coldly. "You should be thankful I still keep you." Those words cut deeper than shouting. At public events, the distance between them was visible. Silas stood tall, confident, surrounded by admirers. Amara stood beside him like a shadow, smiling when cameras flashed, shrinking when they turned away. People whispered. Some pitied her. Others envied her, not knowing the loneliness behind the wealth. Home silence ruled. Dinner plates were set for two but eaten by one. The television played to empty sofas. The bed felt colder every night. Amara began to retreat inward. She stopped asking questions. She stopped expecting kindness. She learned to measure her words carefully, afraid that any challenge would trigger rage or punishment. Sometimes Silas cut off her access to funds for weeks, not because money was scarce, but because control pleased him. Yet cracks also appeared in Silas. He grew impatient at home, restless, easily irritated. The house no longer soothed him. He complained constantly, blaming Amara for his stress, his anger, his dissatisfaction. He did not see that the peace he destroyed was poisoning him too. Late at night, Amara stood by the window, watching his convoy leave again. She wondered when love had turned into endurance. She wondered how long a heart could survive neglect. What she didn't know was this. While her marriage crumbled in silence, the truth about Silas was gathering strength elsewhere. The distance he created at home pushed him closer to danger outside. And every crack in his private life weakened the walls protecting him. The home without peace was preparing him for a world without mercy. Mira knew one mistake could cost her everything. So she built order. What began as scattered recordings and screenshots became a system. Precise, layered, and impossible to erase. In a small, quiet room far from Silas's world, she spread documents across a table and started arranging the truth. Dates first. Then names. Then amounts. Then consequences. Each crime had a place. Each recording had a label. Every document was matched with a voice, a location, and a witness. Drug shipments aligned with bank transfers. Land seizures matched forged signatures. Threats corresponded with disappearances. Nothing stood alone. She created timelines that told stories without emotion. Cold, factual, undeniable. She cross-checked everything. If one file failed, another would speak. If one device was lost, 3 more existed elsewhere. Mira backed up the evidence in layers. Encrypted drives hidden in separate locations. Cloud accounts under different identities. Secure messages scheduled to release if anything happened to her. She thought like someone who knew power would fight back. Sometimes, as she listened to recordings late at night, her hands shook. Silas's voice filled the room. Laughing, boasting, threatening. She paused often, breathing slowly, reminding herself why she was doing this. For the widows, for the silenced workers, for Amara, living in quiet humiliation. For the names that never made the news. Mira rehearsed the release like a battle plan. She prepared press packets, clean summaries for journalists, raw files for investigators, short clips for the public. She stripped away anything emotional, anything personal. The truth did not need drama. It needed clarity. She also prepared herself. She changed routines. She stopped meeting Silas as often. She deleted messages from her phone while keeping copies elsewhere. She learned how to smile normally while carrying a storm inside her bag. Silas noticed none of it. He was too busy enjoying his clean hands, too confident in the walls he believed money had built. He joked about scandals ruining other men, unaware that his own had already been assembled piece by piece. By the time Mira finished, the wall stood complete, thick with facts, reinforced with proof, and ready to fall outward. It was no longer a question of courage. It was timing. And Mira was done waiting. The night Dino fell did not feel dramatic. Felt comfortable. Rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows of the private apartment overlooking the city. The lights below shimmered like promises. Silas arrived late, relaxed, already half smiling. He loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and sank into the couch like a man who believed tomorrow belonged to him. Mira moved quietly. She checked nothing in front of him. She asked no questions. She only ensured what needed to be on was already on. Small, unseen, perfectly placed. The room looked ordinary. That was the point. Silas drank. Silas talked. He complained about the stupid noise online, laughed about how scandals always faded, and bragged about how he would handle the next critic. His voice grew louder, freer. Pride did the work fear never could. "I've buried worse," he said, swirling his glass. "Judges eat from my hands. Please salute me. Who can touch me?" Mira leaned back, calm. "People talk," she said softly. Silas laughed. "Let them. By next week, they'll forget." He spoke about land he planned to seize next. About a journalist who needed silencing. About money already waiting in offshore accounts. He mocked his wife openly, calling her weak, irrelevant, replaceable. "She lives well. That should be enough." The words hung heavy in the air. Then came the moment he sealed it. Careless, arrogant, certain. Silas pulled Mira closer, intoxicated by power and wine. He spoke into the night, into the room, into the truth he believed was invisible. His voice was clear. His face unmistakable. His words unfiltered. Every second was captured. When the night ended, Silas slept peacefully, unaware. Mira dressed quietly. She stood once, looking at him, at the man who had destroyed so many lives with laughter and envelopes. There was no anger in her eyes. Only resolve. She left before dawn, carrying nothing but a small bag and a certainty that could not be undone. By sunrise, Dino's world was already collapsing, though he still didn't know it. The final night had passed, and the truth was awake. The explosion came without warning. At exactly 6 a.m., while the city was still stretching awake, the first post appeared. Then another. Then hundreds more, each carrying pieces of a truth too heavy to ignore. Videos, voice recordings, bank transfers, land documents, timelines, names. Everything dropped at once. By the time Dino's phone began to vibrate endlessly on his bedside table, his face was already everywhere. On screens, on timelines, on television, on the lips of millions. The video from the apartment spread fastest. There was no editing, no filters. Just Silas's own voice, his own face, his own words, boasting, confessing, laughing at the law. Within minutes, hashtags trended nationwide. By the hour they trended globally. People stopped at bus stops to watch, market women gathered around phones in disbelief. Office workers abandoned their desks. Anger erupted. Victims found courage. Former staff spoke out. Widows posted photos of demolished homes. Journalists replayed old accidents and disappearances with new understanding. Everything suddenly made sense. Television stations broke regular programming. Anchors struggled to hide shock as evidence rolled across their screens. International media joined in. Human rights organizations issued statements. Foreign governments asked questions. Silas's party released a short denial. It lasted less than an hour. When journalists matched documents to government records, when banks confirmed transactions, when voice analyses matched Silas's own public speeches, the denial collapsed. Allies went silent. Phones stopped answering. Doors closed. At home, Amara watched the news in stunned stillness. She recognized his voice immediately. She recognized his cruelty. She recognized the lies she had lived with for years. Tears came, not of shock, but of release. Silas woke into chaos. His calls went unanswered. His aides avoided him. Security men watched him differently now. Not with loyalty, but caution. For the first time, fear touched him. Not fear of enemies, but fear of truth. Outside, protesters flooded the streets. They carried placards with his face crossed out. They chanted names of the dead and displaced. Police tried to contain the crowd, but the anger was bigger than barricades. The internet had done what bullets could not. It had removed his protection. By nightfall, warrants were being prepared. Investigators who once bowed now demanded files. The system Silas owned was suddenly embarrassed to be associated with him. And somewhere far from the noise, Mira watched quietly, not with triumph but with certainty. The truth was no longer hers to protect. It belonged to everyone. Daylight stripped Dino of his final illusion. The morning sun was barely warm when a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled into the compound. This time they did not salute. They did not wait. They did not ask for permission. Warrants were read. Slowly, clearly, and loudly enough for the cameras already gathering outside the gates. Silas stepped out of his house in a tailored suit, jaw tight, eyes darting. For a brief moment, he tried to summon the old confidence. The look that once bent rooms to his will failed him. "Call the Inspector General," he ordered sharply. No one moved. "Call the Minister," he repeated. Phones stayed in pockets. The officers approached with professionalism, not fear. One of them met Silas's eyes and spoke the words he had never expected to hear directed at him. "You are under arrest." Handcuffs clicked shut in broad daylight. Cameras flashed wildly. Journalists shouted questions. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. The man who once arrived in convoys of power was now escorted like an ordinary suspect. Head lowered, surrounded, exposed. Silas tried to speak. "I'll cooperate," he said, forcing a smile. "This is all a misunderstanding." No one responded. As he was guided into the vehicle, reality settled in with crushing weight. This was not a private negotiation. This was not a case to be delayed. This was not something money could erase quietly. The evidence was already public. The world was already watching. At the police headquarters, Silas sat alone in a bare room. No aides, no lawyers yet, no special treatment. The walls were plain. The chair was hard. The silence was deafening. For the first time in years, no one bowed. Outside, protesters cheered as news of the arrest spread. Some cried. Some prayed. Some simply stood still, absorbing the moment they never believed would come. At home, Amara watched the footage again and again. The handcuffs, the lowered head, the flashing cameras. He felt no joy. Only a quiet, steady relief. Power had finally released its grip. Dino had fallen in the place he least expected. Under the open sky, before the eyes of everyone he once ruled. And as the cell door closed behind him, one truth became unavoidable. The daylight he avoided all his life had finally found him. The courtroom was full long before the judge arrived. People lined the corridors, clutching phones and whispered hopes. Some had traveled overnight from villages whose names never appeared on maps anymore, villages Dino had erased with a signature. Others were journalists, activists, and families of men who never returned home. When Silas was brought in, the room fell silent. Gone was the confident politician who once dominated rallies. He sat stiffly in the dock, dressed neatly, eyes tired, jaw clenched. He avoided looking at the gallery. He avoided looking at the judge. He avoided looking at the truth. The prosecution opened calmly. They did not shout. They did not insult. They simply presented facts. Recordings played. Silas's own voice filling the room, stripped of power, stripped of protection. The court listened as he bragged about bribing judges, silencing critics, seizing land, and abusing authority. Documents followed. Bank transfers, forged land titles, offshore accounts, call logs. Each piece locked perfectly into place. Witnesses came forward one by one. A former aide described how orders were given in coded language. A displaced widow held up old land papers. Her hands shaking, a dismissed worker spoke of threats and hush money. An investigator explained how cases were buried deliberately. Some witnesses cried. Some spoke with anger. Some spoke with relief. Silas's lawyers tried to interrupt, claiming entrapment, conspiracy, political witch hunt. The judge listened patiently, then asked a simple question. Is this your voice? Are these your signatures? Do you deny these transactions? Silas said nothing. For the first time in his life, silence worked against him. Outside, the public watched live updates. Every testimony reopened wounds, but it also healed something long broken, belief. People began to believe again that power could answer to law. After weeks of proceedings, the final day arrived. The judge read the verdict slowly, deliberately, without emotion. Each charge was addressed. Each crime acknowledged. Each lie dismantled. Guilty on corruption on abuse of office on illegal land acquisition on conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Silas felt the words land like stones. Sentencing followed, long, unavoidable, final. Properties seized. Counts frozen. Political positions revoked. The name that once commanded fear now existed only in court records. As Silas was led away, no one clapped. No one shouted. Justice did not need celebration. It had already spoken. Prison was quiet. For a man who once lived surrounded by noise, sirens, convoys, praise, fear, the silence was unbearable. Dino woke each day to the same gray walls, the same metal door, the same routine that did not bend for money or status. No aides waited outside, no phones rang, no one bowed. In the early weeks, Silas still believed rescue would come. He replayed old favors in his mind, convinced someone powerful would intervene. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The world moved on without him. His name faded from conversations. His face disappeared from screens. New scandals replaced his old one. The mansions were seized and locked. Expensive cars gathered dust. Accounts once heavy with stolen wealth were frozen or emptied by court orders. The empire he built on fear collapsed into paperwork and sealed gates. In a different part of the city, Mira breathed again. She left the house that had been her prison, not dramatically, not with anger, but with quiet dignity. She chose a smaller life, free from guards and silence. For the first time in years, she slept without fear of footsteps at midnight. People recognized her in public sometimes. Some apologized. Some admired her strength. She accepted neither pity nor praise. She simply lived. And Mira vanished. No interviews, no speeches, no victory tours. She left behind one final statement, released through a lawyer, short and steady. Justice does not belong to heroes. It belongs to truth. Then she disappeared into anonymity, carrying scars no one would ever see, and a peace no power could buy. The country remembered. Communities returned to courtrooms with hope. Victims spoke louder. Officials worked more carefully, knowing silence was no longer guaranteed. The story of Dino became a warning whispered in corridors of power, that even the strongest walls fall, that secrets rot, that truth waits. And somewhere behind bars, a man who once ruled lives learned the final lesson too late. Power can silence people, but it cannot silence truth forever.
Please don't forget to subscribe, like and comment.